Hello everyone and welcome to another podcast episode. This is number 2. I've been very eager to do this one and it's been a long time coming. Basically what's happened was I had this beautiful episode that had been recorded and then 5 minutes before the kind of session ended that I was recording, because I was doing stuff about Boha, about armour, and about the sport itself. But 5 minutes before the session ended, my phone was recording some epic armoured fights and it got knocked over and absolutely smashed. I mean, you can kind of see from this, absolutely obliterated. Look at that. And so they are not recoverable. I mean, if anyone has any ideas on how I can recover it, then please do let me know, because it's all for nothing otherwise. But besides that, we are back again today to talk about something that's quite similar to what we were talking about last week. Last time we were talking about this idea of imperialism, whereas today we're talking about unions, which is something that isn't really touched upon, because typically in history we look at kind of these ideas of conquests and wars, but the idea of kind of a political union is not really something that's looked at. And so we're going to be looking at kind of the rise and fall, the maintenance of political unions, and then we're going to look at a case study looking at Scandinavia in order to really understand kind of how these things came about. But it is a really interesting concept, and I do hope that you enjoy it. So let us jump right into it, really, with this. So by 1500, which is the kind of the period where these kind of unions were taking place, there were 500 independent political units in Europe. Now, to put that into context, nowadays, well, I'm not sure about nowadays, but by the 1900s, there was 25. Now, it might even be less nowadays, really, or it might be actually a couple more, but in any case, 25, from 500 down to 25. And essentially, what was so popular in this period is this idea of a composite state. There was a political union between multiple countries under one sovereign rule. Now, obviously, the most recognizable of which is the one that I myself are currently living in, which is the UK. That is a medieval union, the active union with England and Scotland, and then Scotland, England and Wales, and then later on Northern Ireland, is a political union under one rule. And so that's essentially the basis of what this is, this kind of idea that, well, essentially multiple states under one rule. So there are two types of categories that kind of, or classes of a composite state. The first of which is one separated by sea. So this is, for instance, England and Ireland, and as also seen in the case of the Spanish Habsburgs, with that kind of idea of Spain and the Netherlands being quite far away. Another one, of course, is the Holy Roman Empire and Sicily when they had that union. And then the other one, of course, is then the opposite of that, which ones that border. So, for instance, England and Wales, England and Scotland, Poland and Lithuania, for instance. Now, the thing about composite empires and why they were seemingly so popular is because, well, they were actually kind of advantageous. They enabled both countries to gain wealth, resources and prestige by building a union with those who had cultural, administrative or language affiliation. And that was kind of key in a way, that these unions typically, now not always, but typically were taking place in very local areas where you had cultural affiliation, language affiliation, even religious affiliation. Now, that's not always true, but more often than not, that was the case. And what developed that's really interesting is this notion of kind of self-government within a union. So Machiavelli, the one and only, writes about the treatment of recently conquered republics. Now, he says that in order to maintain, I guess, social order, you have to either destroy the republic, the province entirely, absolutely destroy it, build up from scratch. You could live there because that imposes a degree of control, or you can let them self-govern. And I mean, that last one becomes really popular way in which these political unions run and maintain themselves, because it was the most straightforward way of doing it. The idea being that the kingdom continued a degree of independence and preserved their own laws and customs and privileges. Machiavelli also states, which is quite interesting, that the best way to maintain a union is by imposing an oligarchical government. Now, that's a government that's kind of run by, you could say, rich families, wealthy families, powerful families, that kind of, in a sense, runs on patronage. By keeping these families loyal to you, you're keeping the kingdom loyal to you. And this is something that, again, is really, really special and really focused upon and emphasized, because as soon as these systems of patronage begin to break down, loyalty and this kind of union itself begins to break down. And so composite monarchies were therefore built on basically a mutual, I guess you could, I mean, not necessarily a respect, but a mutual trade between the crown and the provincial ruling class that was typically the elites that were allowed to self-govern and have these customs and laws, and basically from here personal loyalty could foster. But the idea was essentially is that if you had a political union, you would at least attempt to harness every opportunity to further unify in law, religion, government, whilst basically suppressing hostilities. It was a very difficult job. Now, what could break it down and jeopardize this was religious division. You know, when the Reformation comes and when there is, you know, notions of heresy and a division's created, suddenly then basically these unions break down, a social order breaks down. Because of course you then get things like aggressive religious nationalism, and the need to replace the ruling class to a religious affiliation. So, for instance, how Scotland wanted to have a Catholic king, rather than, you know, Anglican or Protestant. You know, you get the idea. The other thing as well that's quite interesting as well that could jeopardize political unions was the discovery of America, because subordinate kingdoms suddenly could colonize and form their own empires. We see this with Scotland, for instance, which Scotland, when the New World starts to become more established, establishes its own colonies, and this kind of, you know, in terms of political unions, you know, if they are a subordinate nation and suddenly they're starting to grow, again, that can tip the scales. And so political unions are all about this kind of idea of balance. Everything in the ecosystem has to be perfect, and essentially it could only survive if these, you know, if the original agreements were kept and if these systems of patronage were kept in balance. And essentially, some places did this quite skillfully. 16th century France, for instance, skillfully maintained patronage and created religious unity, which made it highly unified and highly powerful. But that being said, there's plenty of places, for example, the British Isles, where political unions did fail, and could not impose solution through war and maintain those systems. So, you know, Scotland, since, you know, forever really, has been banking and really pushing for this kind of strong nationalist identity, and assault independence. Now, there's an interesting exercise that I would put to anyone from the British Isles, which is, you know, to what extent would you consider yourself English or Scottish or Welsh or Irish or British? And typically, when I asked around, it's quite interesting because, you know, for the people in England are typically maybe inclined to say that they're British, whereas if you ask a Scottish person or a Welsh person, they are more inclined to identify with that kind of nationalistic heritage rather than the I guess the imposed political union. They're more likely to say Scottish than they are British, and you know, it just shows you that you know, once these things break down, they're very difficult to recover, and it is really temperamental to be able to uphold a union, and not many places were able to successfully do this, but the ones that did were able to for various reasons. The main one is the fact if you are bordering. Now, obviously, that wasn't the case with Spain and Portugal, but the fact that essentially the kind of British Isles have been able to stay unified is because of the fact we border. It's very easy to interact with each other because of the fact you're bordering. And this was the case with the Holy Roman Empire and various other unions that did border. But essentially, basically, it seems that in a continent and period where traditional rights, privileges, and customs were respected, then union seems to fit well and of the needs of the time. Basically, there was military strength and protection, self-government, guaranteed elite provincial privileges, and just really a wide range of benefits from being included into the wider association. And so that's why even when they start to break down, quite often unions are at least attempted to be upheld because there are so many benefits. So I think with that in mind, I think that, you know, let's move on to, I guess, our case study now. Now, our case study is actually really interesting because it's the Kalmar Union. The Kalmar Union is from 1397 to 1523. Now, it's a bit earlier than 1523, but there are efforts to kind of reinvigorate it, but ultimately failed. But 1523 is the kind of final finishing date. Now, to understand about the Kalmar Union, that was the union between Denmark, Sweden, and Norway, we have to understand the kind of crisis that was involved that led to it. Now, typically, with all unions, a kind of succession crisis is pretty much the spark that begins them, but there are longer-term events. Now, when we look at Scandinavia, primarily Denmark, you know, the Black Death and the agrarian crisis of the 1300s really created a weakened monarchy and a weakened state. And there was also, quite interestingly, that becomes extremely important, border battles between Denmark and the region of Schleswig over ruling. Unfortunately, Eric who was the king of Denmark in the early 1300s, had to give over Schleswig to the German counts. Now, if we cut closer to the time to a king called Olaf, Olaf was the son of the Norwegian king Håkon VI, who took the throne in 1380. However, he sadly died in 1387. Now, this is where this kind of idea of a succession crisis comes in. In terms of this union, firstly, there was a union between Norway and Denmark because the Norwegian king died and the Danish princess and widow gained regency of Denmark and Norway. So there's already a union through inheritance. Now, we see this quite often, which I believe is actually the case of the Spanish Habsburgs. They were able to, a vast amount of their political unions were through inheritance and through marriage. And it's quite a common aspect of it, rather than a conquest. Now, what we have to understand, which is also another interesting concept about foreign rule and about natives and kind of this ethnic disparity, is that Sweden at this time was currently being ruled by a German king in 1387 called Albert of Mecklenburg. So Margaret, who was the new regent of this small political union, was invited by the kind of nobles and aristocracy of Sweden, who recognised her as their rightful lord. Now, that in itself is really interesting, because when we talk about gendered roles, typically you have king, queen, lord, lady. Now, Sweden saw Margaret as fulfilling the role of the male role as lord, which was really interesting in terms of how kind of women wielded power. She was recognised as lord and king rather than lady and queen. But anywho, she was asked essentially by the Swedish aristocrats now to invade and defeat the German king and kind of unify Scandinavia, which she undertook. And essentially, the German king was thrown out and defeated in 1389. Following this, her nephew, Eric, was elected as king of Norway, and 7 years later was recognised at Kalmar as holding the crown of all three kingdoms. Now, just quickly, it's interesting when we spoke earlier about these kind of systems of patronage, that the Swedish aristocracy, who are these kind of commanding local elite, asked for the union to happen. So essentially, if we think about in terms of the union, what Machiavelli said, if Scandinavia is to uphold this union, then these aristocrats then have to be loyal to the union as well. But in terms of the union itself, the Kalmar Union, there were certain conditions. So these are the following conditions. If no heir was born, all three kingdoms would elect a common monarch. All kingdoms would defend each other, and the king should control foreign policy with the advice of the councillors from the kingdom he was resident in. Which is, so from these two aspects, it's a very shared union. It's quite similar to NATO, attack on one, attack on all. And it's also a very equal union in this sense. We have, rather than one country imposing on another, all three countries have equal standing in the election of a common monarch, which is really, really interesting for this time period. There were other conditions as well, mainly that the construction of private fortresses was forbidden, and those built after Albert's ascension were demolished. Now, again, this is reminiscent of Machiavelli, to kind of destroy the province that you're taking over. We can't allow these private fortresses to be built. We can't allow these kind of the people in this political union to kind of grow, just in case they switch their loyalty. Equally, which again is really interesting when we think back to how political unions are run, each country was to be governed by its own laws in home and foreign affairs. And again, this is really important because, as we said earlier, one of the best ways to maintain a union was to allow you could say, subordinate nations to self-govern. And so all of these are upheld in the Kalmar Union, and it kind of does work for a while. There was urban investment, and there was continued policies from Margaret's reign that were very successful, and for a good 50 years, it did work. However, by 1434, there were issues. Now, when we thought back to before Margaret's reign, with the previous king, Eric, there was obviously this issue with Schleswig, and this re-emerges. So this new Eric and Sigismund essentially, through mass legal intervention, attempt to reclaim Schleswig as their own. And this is actually achieved in 1424. Now, not to say, however, that this wasn't without military conflicts and financial burdens. And it's this financial burdens that really, really starts to break down the political union. Because from 1434, an insurgent revolt begins in Sweden because of the kind of the religious burden, the political burden, but most importantly the economic burden that was placed because of what Eric's dealings in trying to regain a duchy. Now, this insurgency was pro-union, which is quite interesting, but they wanted more freedom. So they wanted to appoint a marshal and seneschal. They wanted to be governed by Swedish law. They wanted government officials to be Swedish only, and this was afforded. This was agreed upon in 1435. However, and this is in a way the problem is by, I guess, giving away too much, is that this then actually spurred on similar insurgency in Norway. And because the king at the time, Eric, was too weak, he could not uphold those systems of patronage, could not uphold his imposition of rule, and had to basically recognise all these claims. So already by 1439, the union was not being upheld. It had already started to deteriorate. And essentially, what we then see from here, from 1438 onwards, we just see time and time again succession issues. There was a legal stalemate, essentially, with the way in which officials were elected. Danish common law stood against Norwegian and Swedish statute law, and against preserving union was Danish and Swedish election law. All of this kind of amalgamated into a sense, into a way that basically a new king was really difficult to elect. And time again over the following century, basically the Kalmar Union is continuously under a succession crisis that essentially leads to its downfall. Because what happens is, by 1471, Sweden and Finland become preoccupied with the Baltics, and they form, in a way, actually their own union, a separate union. And then Denmark and Norway focus on the North Sea and develop equally as two different political unions alongside each other. But, however, they do remain allies, which is kind of really important, this kind of idea of switching between union and allies. But ultimately, because the aristocracy could not be upheld, because the relations with the church could not be upheld, because of the legal issues and all these issues outlined by Machiavelli, because of all this, it meant the political union just fell away. And this is something that we see time and time again in different case studies. As much as crisis can bring union together, it can also break it apart. But I do hope, however, that you have found this deeply interesting. And there are some brilliant things to read. I will just tell you of them now. To read about political unions and composite empires, do read from Elliott's A Europe of Composite Monarchies, which is deeply interesting, and do read, here we go, Koenigsberger, who discusses composite states, representative institutions, and the American Revolution. Now, it's not often, especially as a medievalist, that you delve into such ideas. America, in most of what we're talking about, doesn't exist to the knowledge of Europeans. So it's interesting, actually, the idea of kind of the colonies in America being a union that breaks down in the same way that the Kalmar Union does. Nevertheless, thank you very much for watching. I do hope you enjoyed, and I shall see you next time for another topic. Who knows what it will be? But thank you very much, and I'll see you next time.